Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us for another Digital Leader Show, where each week we discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader. This week, we're discussing regulating innovation and AI, plus headlines for digital leaders from the world of enterprise technology. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. The audio recording is available on major podcast platforms. And don't forget to check us out at DEInetwork.com for coaching, assistance, industry briefings, and peer-to-peer groups. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up the Digital Enterprise Institute, as well as the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence. We're a professional association and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members worldwide, all around automation, enterprise AI, and digital transformation. My co-host is Carlos Alvarenga. He's a researcher, an author, an educator at the University of Maryland in Georgetown, and former advisor at EY and Accenture. Carlos, welcome back.
Good afternoon, Dan. Good to see you again.
So, lots happening as always, but the theme this week is everybody freaking out about technology.
Right, and we start with today's headline of the letter that came out, I guess, today in the New York Times. Over 1,000 technologists, scientists, researchers saying it's time to hit the pause button on AI development. This is going too far, too fast. And so I spent the morning looking at the letter, some of the background behind that. It was a very interesting conversation that's now being generated through this, I think, this letter, which just continue what's been, like you said, what's been happening, which is thinking through what are we actually building, right? And what are we unleashing? And do we have it under control or not?
Yeah, there's a couple different, places where it seems like this conversation picked up this week. The one you mentioned was maybe the more surprising of the few, which was Elon Musk, who's often thought of as a big defender and proponent of all technology, but where AI is a big part of what Tesla does and some of these other companies he's involved with does. So the letter, the foundation that issued the letter, which had I think it was over 100 signatures from tech leaders, is actually
it's over. I checked it.
1,000. Sorry, yeah, I missed a zero. 1,000. Yeah.
Right, it's over 1,000.
And it's this nonprofit that apparently the Musk Foundation is a big funder of, called the Future of Life Institute. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that what started this kind of thread for me this week was seeing the European Union update on what they're trying to do from a regulatory standpoint. But it's interesting that not just the regulators are looking at this.
Right, and in thinking about this and getting ready for this week's show, did a little bit of reading around different positions of how would you regulate this, right? But I think it starts with what is the metaphor for AI? There was an interesting article in the Atlantic which talked about, is this like nuclear weapons? Is this like electricity? Is this like vaccines, right? What are we, which is exactly that article, right? What are we creating here? And I think that the first question is that nobody's quite sure. This is like X problem, right? So there isn't necessarily a model that jumps to mind. Oh, let's just take what we did here. For example, electric cars, right? What's happening with there is you're saying, well, we've had cars for 100 years. So let's import, right? Let's export the regulatory framework around making combustion cars, right? Internal combustion cars, and let's apply that to this new industry called electric vehicles. Here, there's no one-to-one match. So it seems like things like Future of Life are saying, let's go back to the drawing board and let's think through what of any existing frameworks are we going to port over, and are there pieces that are going to have to be created uniquely for AI because we've never quite had anything like this, right? And I think the closest one maybe is nuclear weapons to in some ways, but it isn't really, right? Nobody was making nuclear weapons as a consumer product. So this is a completely different thing. The interesting question for me in thinking through all these different viewpoints and articles and white papers was, you get three pieces of the puzzle. There is, when governments regulate industry, they tend to regulate one or all of three things. First is the inputs to something, right? You can't make food out of the following things, right? You can only make food out of the following, out of this approved sort of list, right? So when you when something enters your process, the government has okayed what can be used to enter the production process. There's the production process itself, right? This is the way, it has to be made under these conditions in this kind of laboratory, in this kind of factory. And then there's the output itself. What you produce can't blow up. It can't do this, right? It has to be exactly what it says it's going to do. So in this case, we have none of those, right? No one has said when you make AI machines, you have to use this particular kind of code. Nobody has said, as far as I know, when you make it, you must follow these rules. And nobody has said, when you produce an AI machine, it can only do these things and it shouldn't be doing any one of the other things. So we have a completely wide open structure, right? Industry that's being born with no precedent to it. And I think that the letter had a point. It says, look, we don't know what we're creating. And none of these structures are in place. So why don't we all just pause at GPT-4 until we can sort some of these things through?
Yeah, I'm very conflicted on this debate, and I've had conversations with friends and family where just because of my nature, I'll take the opposite side of the debate. But as you know, I'm very much a technologist. I'm very much a capitalist, and so I think last week, I was giving you a hard time about the legislation, trying to block the Ubers and the Lyfts from being tech companies, and instead of trying to classify them as transportation companies. And so I'm very, very hesitant anytime somebody, especially a government agency, comes in and says, hey, we're gonna regulate this, especially when if you're watching any of the TikTok ban hearings on Capitol Hill.
Right.
At one point some congressman yells out at the CEO and says, we're definitely going to ban TikTok. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. These guys, these ancient guys who, can't spell IT are going to try to regulate this thing. But, I think the difference is that this has the capability of being so pervasive and so wide ranging across, beyond technology, really in society as a whole, that I think, and you bring up a good point, which is, not only do we not know, what where we're going, but there's no kind of structure to even if you talk to some of the development teams within these companies, they don't even realize what they're creating. I mean, the famous thing was the Microsoft chatbot a few years ago that they shut down in 24 hours because it was scraping chat rooms and became racist in a day or so, right? So they don't even know why some of these things are happening. And then you enter in companies that their primary motive is going to be profitability. And so to me, if you look at what's happened with the web in general, and then with social media, which we've talked about extensively, the misinformation issues of social media, it's the non-regulation has failed, and this has 100x the potential that even the web or social media, I think, has by comparison.
Well, I've written about my theory, I call the Lynn effect, right? And the Lynn effect is a story that goes back to my very good friend who always wanted to have a stereo by a company called Lynn. And he finally, they're very expensive, he finally is able to afford this amazing stereo. I go visit him in Belgium. It's back in days of CDs. And I bring along one of my favorite CDs and you pop it into Lynn and he starts playing it. And it sounds awful. And it's 50,000 euro stereo. So I said, I don't get it. And he's super excited that I'm noticing how terrible the music is. And I said, this is, you paid 50,000 euros for a stereo that makes your CDs sound worse. He goes, that's right. He goes, isn't it incredible? And I said, well, you walk me through this. And he said, well, the thing is that your recording has lots of flaws in it. And in your cheapo stereo at home, you can't reproduce all the flaws. But the Lin is so amazing that it shows you what a bad recording it was. And I said, it's remarkable. So I said, so what's the solution? Well, you have to buy a CD that was recorded with Lin studio equipment, right? So the circle continues. But I call this the Lin effect. And to me, what it means is that a technology that rather than making something better, it actually creates more problems than it solves. And what I've written about is that if you look back at most major technologies, the Lin effect is present. We solve problem A, and in solving problem A, you create problems X, Y, Z, D, and E, right? And it takes a generation for new innovators to come and then solve the problems that are the byproducts of the first solution. If you think about the internet, social media, I've argued that as a whole, the things they fixed pale into the set of problems they've left behind. And if the Lynn effect holds, and there's no reason why it shouldn't, then we're about to see the same thing happen again. Whatever problem AI is trying to solve, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but we can be pretty sure that it's going to give us a whole plate full of problems that we can't even imagine right now. And it'll take a generation or two of additional work until that finally gets solved, right? And so and the problem is that we have no idea what those are. We can't even conceive of, right, what is the problem. Electric vehicle, you can sit down and say, okay, what are the worst case scenarios? It crashes into somebody in the street. Well, it's already happening in some cases, but all right, there's only so much a rogue Tesla can do. What a rogue AI engine, a rogue, right, GPT-10 could do, who knows, Dan?
So you're in the alarmist category, which by the way, a lot of people are, right? I mean, that Atlantic article, that you mentioned, and, and we talked last week.
Let me push back. I wouldn't say I'm an alarmist. I'm saying that it's just an unknown variable. Like, I don't know. So you could say, could the house be on fire? Maybe. The house might be fine. I don't know. I'm not turning on the alarm. All I'm saying is I don't know that the house isn't on fire. Right.
Well, and and if there's a chance of it, why? Well, we got to do something about it. So I think it was in this Atlantic article, but there was an article, where they were referring back to, the pre World War II and the Manhattan Project, and there was a scientist that came out and said, hey, there might be this thing where if we ignite the atomic bomb, it may ignite the entire sky atmosphere and kill everybody on Earth, and to the extent that he actually said, better to be a Nazi than to end up dead, right? And so if there's any chance of this being true, we have to look into it. And actually, we talked last week about that, another not-for-profit group that had an event in New York a couple weeks back where they said the same kind of thing, about this being, of the potential gravity of nuclear weapons. And it's the same crew of people that were behind the Social Dilemma documentary that's on Netflix, which I think scared the crap out of everybody, who hadn't thought about the social media ramifications. And this is, like I said, much bigger.
I guess the thing is, are there steps we could take at this point? That's not because we're not really ready to regulate AI, I don't think. But as the letter from the Future of Life group said, there are some things we could do. Maybe it's time to look. At least to me, it strikes me as one thing we could do is look at pharma, right, and the way in which we develop medicines and drugs. My wife's a scientist, so I watch her go through these controls and the things all the various steps she has to take, right, in order to get anything done. And we might say, look, at the very basic, any major AI should have to go through ethics review board, right? So tell me what you're going to do. Tell me how if it's going to impact people, especially, right? What do you expect to happen? And then let's review what is going on through that process on to regular basis. If we think about OpenAI and we think of it as a vaccine, imagine that somebody completely in secret just tomorrow announced, I've cured cancer.
Yep.
And they go, what? And you go, we didn't know, but yeah, I've been working in my lab in Silicon Valley for the last 3 years. I didn't tell anybody, right? I've done experiments. I've cured people who are sick, and we have cured cancer. We have cancer 1.0 ready to go. And I can't tell you anything about it because it's a secret, right? And so what do who's up first? Like, sign up right here. Like, it would be accessible to us, right? And yet that's kind of what happened with OpenAI.
By the way, that's also what happened. That's also, and again, I give you a little bit of a hard time. I'm really on the fence about it. I see both sides of it, but for anybody watching who's saying, we pure capitalist and anti-government regulate, the same thing happened with, not to get political, but the same thing happened with with COVID, with the COVID vaccines, right? A lot of the people that were anti-regulation were all of a sudden for regulation when it came to not having to be forced to take a vaccine that they feel it wasn't tested and verified by regulators. regulators. So I think you're right. I think there is a balance that can be struck here.
And that vaccine went through a process. Okay, again, I'm familiar with it. It was accelerated. We can criticize. Look, you sped up a process, but it wasn't. There wasn't any no process. It was just an accelerated process. Maybe some timelines were cut shorter than they normally would be, etc. But in the case of OpenAI, which is what's generating all of this conversation, really, it just came out of the blue. There wasn't any public discourse. There were no town hall meetings. The OpenAI didn't sit down and say, "Are you guys okay if we unleash this in the world tomorrow?" They just made.
I don't even think there's any intentions, Carlos. Right? I mean, you could say like with Pfizer and the drug companies, whether you believe it or not, or you're critical, but they have a mission statement. They're a company with a mission statement. They're trying to solve this problem. It's a specific disease that they're trying to fix. Right? I mean, some of the stuff that's coming out, especially now, because there's this this AI race going on where there's all these companies that are very rapidly trying to get things into market. And I don't even know if, forget about testing and ethics and bias and all the other things I know we want to talk about. I don't even know if they have a product roadmap. Never mind thinking about the consequences.
Right, and you can't, because you don't know how to model those today, right? That's one of there's a lot of work over decades has gone into how do you measure, right, whether a drug is working or not. There's a science of measurement, let's call it, right, of analysis of whether a vaccine is effective, on this population with that population. You've got placebo versus non-placebo trials, etc. That doesn't even exist in AI. We don't even know how to, even if a company came tomorrow and say, okay, great, I'm in. I'm going to submit my first product to your clinical trials process. It doesn't exist, right? Science hasn't invented. We don't know. We haven't agreed on how do we take, let's say you and I start an AI company tomorrow, and we're going to make AI that does whatever. We want to submit it to some sort of process. Nobody can tell us, okay, as you're designing it, make sure you include these other steps, right? So that when it comes time for you to be approved, your AI to go to market, right, the approval agency can look into whatever it has to look into. So we haven't even had that conversation, and yet product is running out the door on a daily basis.
So it's funny. Last week you came back from Europe, and you said no one in Europe is talking about AI, and then there was this recent thing about the European Union. So the EU is trying to do this. It's not new, but there's been some new developments, and I think it's on the discussion floor now, where the EU is actually talking about enacting regulation, sort of like this, where they kind of classify AI into various different categories, and then there would be regulations associated with implementing them. And if you don't abide by those, or you don't truthfully file certain, I guess, disclosures, you could end up with some GDPR like fines and limitations.
And it again, right, it goes back to GDPR, where you had hints of this that's just going to come, because they didn't really deal with it there, but they hinted that, hey, we're working on this, and it's this is. But in Europe, you have this, right, which is this is a I want to say top-down approach, where the regulatory agency or the government agency has decided, okay, we're gonna make the first attempt at putting rules here. We tend to not do that until there's some groundswell, right, of activity at the individual level. Think about crypto, we talked about before, right, which is that they're getting into crypto because crypto went retail. And at that point, you're going to harm the individual consumer. Had that hadn't happened, maybe we wouldn't have had that kind of movement. In this particular case, as of right now, we're seeing, which I think is good, the tech industry itself, like Future of Life and others, saying, let's take a pause. My sense is that it isn't the average person who's freaking out about AI in America these days. It tends to be kind of the writers and tech thinkers, and which I guess is what you would expect, right? It's the people in the industry.
The U.S. doesn't seem to care. I mean, we're so, and while there's the debates and there's issues with any kind of regulation. We've talked a lot about on this show. I think we were talking about more about social media and misinformation about a third party group. Maybe not even a government agency, but a third party governing kind of group. But in the U.S., I mean, we're just so focused on to me, silly things like let's ban TikTok. Let's ban this app. And if you watched any of those hearings this week, I mean, it's just a circus. It's typical political theater. And while I'm not saying there's no security risks associated with TikTok, to me, there's just much bigger fish to fry.
Well, it's maybe it's a sad comparison, right? That in one side of the Atlantic, the regulatory effort has been on a serious conversation about AI, thinking through these are the forms, these are the manners. Let's start this process and let's start letting the industry know that we're going to be watching this. On the other side of the pond, we've got, like you said, right? Let's ban TikTok. Show me how to log on so I can be outraged at what I'm about to see, right? And the hearings were farce. It's political theater. I don't think the average person who's using TikTok is worried about TikTok at all. Most people I know were surprised that anybody was. Why are you worried about TikTok? We have so many other issues in this country to worry about. But one was a TikTok show, which was meaningless. And this side, they're starting to have a real conversation about the future of technology that is mostly being created here, which is the other interesting thing, right?
Yeah.
Part of it is that I think maybe part of it, while we said it before last week, is that other countries are more willing to regulate it because it's not one of their industries. Like, not that there isn't AI in Europe, but the nexus of it is right in North America. And so they're more willing to take a harder look at something because it isn't seen as a European creation, as usually with tech, right? We're back to the valley. And so we hesitate to try to put any kind of controls on things that we think is going to make people a lot of money.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I didn't think of it like that. I mean, there are some really interesting, innovative AI companies coming out of Europe, and in fact, I would say in some outside of the big tech, American tech firms, I would actually say some of the better advancements in AI are actually coming out of Europe. But you're right in the sense that the Googles and the Amazons and things, the Ubers and the Lyfts and things, have come out of the U.S. But yeah, you watch those hearings, and it reminded me back to the Mark Zuckerberg Facebook hearings back in the day. Even like we talked a lot about the Ticketmaster antitrust hearings and stuff. And when they started talking about bots and things, I mean, they were asking questions, and the CEO of Ticketmaster, like, he just stared at them. He didn't even know how to answer the question because it was a dumb. It didn't make any sense. And there's other priorities, right? There's huge issues. I just saw this article in TechCrunch this week where the Biden administration is working on this executive order to ban federal agencies from using commercial spyware. Apparently, the government has been buying spyware applications, and they found out that there's at least 50. So there's 50. There's probably 5,000 government employees that have been spied on, where they're getting their information, personal information, location information, and other things. And so this is the next like nuclear arms, maybe dismantlement, where they're saying, hey, we'll kill our spyware apps if you kill your spyware apps. But this is to me, and at least they acknowledged it. But this is there's a huge issue.
Well, I go back to the TikTok for a minute, because the only reason we were hearing on TikTok is that it's Chinese, right? And I'm sure the CEO TikTok, one thing he didn't say is, why am I here, and why am I here alone? So the things you're accusing me or accusing us of doing are scraping up people's identity, right? Buying data. This has been done by American companies for decades. Why are they not having this hearing? As somebody wanted to put out in one of the analysis, look, if TikTok wanted American consumer information, they just buy it on the black market, right? In dark web, you don't need to steal it off the phones. It's available anyway. So this again, if TikTok were based in Silicon Valley, if it were not owned by ByteDance, those hearings would not have happened.
This has apparently been going on for a while. So this TechCrunch piece, it's commercial spyware created by the private sector and sold almost exclusively to governments and nation states. They find flaws on iPhones and Android software. It's stealing people's photos, contacts, call logs, messages, and real-time location data. And it was supposed to be used for, the most, profound criminals, but they're finding it on, they found it on journalist devices, lawyers, human rights defenders. This is happening right within the U.S. And the other one that I don't think we got a chance to talk about, but came out of maybe a month or two ago, is there's this really scary, I think, Wired piece about public cameras and facial recognition, and that's its own topic for another day. But what's really insane about this is that one of these foundations found that there's 14,000 cameras in New York City, surveillance cameras in public places in New York City, all manufactured by this company Hikvision, which is a Chinese-owned company. So why are we not talking about that if you're so concerned about the Chinese government? And what makes it even worse is that they found that out of all the camera manufacturers, this particular manufacturer was the least secure in that they didn't hide the IP addresses of the cameras. So in other words, you can go online and start guessing at IP addresses and actually find live camera feeds in New York City and watch them.
Yeah. Well, we went through the whole Huawei thing a couple of years ago, right? Because they got so much press. But look, you're going to catch, there's hardware makers, there's cameras. Most of the stuff people have in their house is made in China, right? Devices, sensors, lights. And so unless you're going to say, we're just going to stop importing hardware from regions A, B, and C, you're not going to stop this, all right? So there's got to be a different way of attacking this problem, because it's not going to be solved by saying, all right, look, let's go through hardware by hardware category, one by one, and see if, where the problems are, because it's too much.
And you're right. Maybe it is about where the companies are based. It's somehow okay. But this one kind of gets me, like, why this particular company? Why are we not talking about this? So to me, it's mostly political, at least as it relates to the U.S. or it's just incompetence. It's just,
well, no one's heard of Hikvision. So back to the TikTok question. TikTok is because it's on everybody's phone, or at least lots of people's phones, and so that's why it got the press that it got. And then
you bring up a good point with Apple, right? And that's why I say maybe you have a good point around it being a U.S. company. I mean, if you're worried about an app that's on, okay, it's a lot of people's phones, but maybe mostly younger generation phones, but you're not worried about the iPhone itself that has hardware that was manufactured in China. That's okay. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, look, back to the topic of the day, right? And just thinking through, what would you do tomorrow? They make you AI czar, which probably the job that's being invented as we speak somewhere in DC. You say you're going to be in charge of regulating. Where do you start? You start inputs, process, outputs, all of the above.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. One of the things, you mentioned the healthcare thing. I think that's a really good, example. Although there's issues in the healthcare one, right? Around and that piece that we were talking about before. I think addresses this a little bit around certain biases and certain demographics not being represented well. So I think there's a couple different angles of this, right? One is you have bias, right? You have the bias issue. I read a statistic this week that 75% of resumes now are read through algorithms, and don't even get to a person until they've gone through that algorithm. And so, one expert said that, all that technology is illegal based on HR hiring, legislation and things, but they're getting around it because nobody knows what happens inside that black box. And I think that's the real issue. And we've talked about it even from a sales and go-to-market standpoint. It's very difficult. AI is very difficult in a commercial sense, even to sell, because people don't really understand what happens inside, apparently, including some of the companies, developing it. So, I think the answer might be that we have to figure out a way to document all of it, whether it's inputs or output. We have to figure out a way to document it in such a way where, these things don't go to market unless the anticipated result is somewhat in range of what you said it was going to be, and it can't go kind of out of that range. Outside of that one, Malaysian flight. I've been watching that series about that Malaysian flight that disappeared. Outside of those extreme examples, you file a flight plan, right? And if you go off that flight plan, somebody, a bunch of fighter jets pull up next to you and say, "Where are you going?" Right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's a virtual digital version of that where we say you can develop and you got to test, right? The medical field, you got to do, limited tests. You got to do, you would know the terminology, but controlled testing, whatever. And then you got to kind of publish what the goal is, like a patent, publish what the goal is, and if you're like outside of those parameters, you can't move to the next step of development or release.
I think we could also say, like the Europeans are saying, look, there are categories of output. Let's start with the output. If we said we're not going to get into input, we're not going to try to regulate, right, the what goes into these machines, and nor are we going to try to tell Microsoft versus Google how to build them. But once you've got one that you want to release, right, then let's look at, first of all, what are you releasing it into? Is it going into a consumer space like helping to pick music, right, which is very different from, hey, this is AI that's going to run infrastructure or healthcare, or it's going to affect a judicial process like law enforcement, right, or sentencing. If you're in one of the more serious ones, then there is a protocol. There's called an AI safety review board or something like that, right? That's gonna the AIRB. You're gonna have to go through the AIRB, who's gonna review what are you proposing to release, what is its intended purpose, right? And then how are you gonna monitor that it's working? And if it were to fail, how do you go back and analyze the failure so that doesn't happen a second time, right? Like there probably needs to be created an NTSB, right, of AI, right, which would have looked at what happened with Microsoft and said, okay, we're going to break this down, and then share what can be learned, right, with everybody else. So we might just start with saying there are certain. Right now, it's just a big open freeway, right? You can drive your AI machine on it with no particular controls whatsoever. We're going to, first of all, divide the highway into two parts. The part that we are not that worried about, right? Picking TV shows on Netflix. And there's the one, scoring movies. And then there's the side where if you're going to drive on that road, which is flying airplanes, making medicines, right? Deciding whether somebody should go to jail or not, or should be arrested. That's going to be where we first look at this. And then there are going to have to be some steps you take. Now, who controls that process, right? We could start with something which is industry based, with a diverse participation of regulators and industries. It has to be the government to get started, because that would be my first approach. But something where we said, if we're releasing a new product that's going to watch the streets and look for criminals, it's gone through some sort of ethical review board that said, okay, it looks like this is a clean agent, right? It's fit for purpose, and we understand what the risks are. And if there's a problem, there's a mechanism for hitting the emergency stop, like on the subway, and here's what's allowed to pull that cord.
Yeah.
Now nobody can pull the cord. If OpenAI or whatever it is, ChatGPT decided to go bananas, the only one who has the ripcord, right, is OpenAI, not anybody else. And that might be something where we have to put in, right, the cord that you pull, and you say, listen, somebody can pull this cord even if the company isn't willing to, for the following reasons. So there are so many things that we could be doing. We're just not doing anything at this point.
We're not doing anything, and this is this is the thing. I think this is one area where the EU has it right, and I think, and anybody watching can correct me if they disagree, but I think the difference too is that a lot of the people that are involved in this, within the EU side, are practitioners, people in technology, founders of some of these companies, whereas the government regulation stuff happening in the US is always politicians and bureaucrats, often, that don't understand what's going on. And so I think that's a difference. I think this idea of us governing, industries, kind of having an independent group that, because by the way, part of it's governance, right? It doesn't have to be, government regulation. If we could figure out a way to govern ourselves, govern, through third party groups, perhaps. The reason why the regulation ends up happening, I think in the US in particular, is like you said, when something fails, right? When something ultimately blows up. And what I'm concerned about with AI is because it's a black box and because most people don't understand it. I mean, if we can't get politicians to understand what TikTok is, forget about AI, right? So, I'm not as concerned about, okay, AI is flying an airplane and a plane crashes and they shut it down in perpetuity until they figure out what happened. I'm more concerned about the unintended consequences of what we don't realize is happening under the hood. Like the closest example I think we've had of this is cybersecurity, where the average citizen, certainly in America, doesn't even realize how many cyber attacks are happening on a day-to-day basis, right? And so, when you see these things where there's a data breach or a hack, and the company doesn't even find out for a year, 18 months after the fact that they were compromised. It's stuff like that that's going to happen at bigger scale. And then you add that to, companies that don't have any downside. I mean, you look at what happened with FTX and all these, there was no regulation. There was no onset. There's no real downside. I mean, okay, he's going to go to jail, but for everybody else, there was really no downside. And if you don't believe that, this MIT Sloan article references a Gallup poll, and they actually interviewed people. Okay, it was in Europe, but they interviewed people within tech companies, asking them about their employers, and only 25% of the people surveyed said that they thought that their company would do the right thing over profit.
Over profit.
And that's in Europe. Can you imagine in the US? It'd be probably twice that number or half that number.
Well, you're right in the sense that the thing that worries is not necessarily that someone's going to design a system to ruin everybody's life, right? That's probably not going to happen. But the side product, the byproduct, right, of what the thing does is really where it gets worrisome. And I talked to a CIO of one of the big global tech companies a couple of years ago, and we were having this exact conversation. And he said the thing that worries us is something like this. We, just as part of the onboarding process, ask you what your favorite color is, and you thinking it's no big deal, you answer orange. Great. That little piece of information about you sits in a database somewhere for 5 years. Okay, it's useless at the moment it's gathered, but 5 years later, an AI discovers that people who like orange are also people who like to commit fraud. So we decided to retroactively fire everybody who picked orange back in their what's your favorite color test, right? So that's synthetic data, right? We created, right, a new piece of information about you that you didn't give us, but we can create it without your consent, right? And so now you get a termination notice because your favorite color is orange. So he said we're on the cusp of the machines just figuring things out, not that because we programmed them to do it, because they just find
they learned. Yeah, because they learned. That's the difference. There was another example I saw this week where you'll appreciate this because it was within the medical space where they were using AI to be able to predict certain diseases. So things like Parkinson's, being able to tell by voice, changes in.
Yeah, right. Very interesting.
And then the example that was kind of scary is that they were looking at images for skin cancer. And what they ended up finding was that the AI was creating a bias, because what they found out was that a lot of the pictures of people that actually did have tumors had rulers in them. They put rulers in the image to see the size of whatever was on the skin that they were concerned was cancerous. And so the thing learned that usually when there's a ruler in the picture, the person has cancer. So rulers are cancerous, right? And that's hopefully that's something you could catch, because in that scenario, I guess better to be over cautious than under cautious and say, okay, fine, fine, false alarm. But what if you take that to the next iteration where it's doing additional learning and calculations and then executing on some sort of action based on that data bias, right?
Well, we're headed to that world, right, where there's some, and I was looking through the principles of the future of life has a set of the SLOMA rules, I think they're called, and it's these principles that you're supposed to follow if you develop AI, right? And one of them is, especially in judicial settings, that a reasonably competent person can understand how the AI got to its conclusions, right? And that information is available for the right person to review. I think the more and more we see AI in recruiting, in job evaluations and performance evaluations, we're headed to a bunch of lawsuits where someone's going to say the AI fired me and it won't tell me why, right? And you and I know where this is going to go, which is that I'm going to be able to tell you that we're letting you go because the AI decided that you're not, you shouldn't work here anymore. And you can't ask me why, right? It's just what the machine said, right? You're just not gonna work out for us in the future. So because it crunched the numbers,
Right.
and decided that 2 years after your MBA, you're not a good prospect, and we're not gonna keep investing in you. Which reminds me, when I worked at my very first consulting company, and then we got bought by another one, and the first one was, I used to call it was subjective, personal subjectivity. You met with a partner and you had a long conversation about your year, and then that led to your eval, and with you got a raise and that whatever. When the new firm came in, they had this very complicated digitized process. You answered 500 questions and it measured you and had statistics, right? And as they were reading out to everybody the results of the reviews, and people complained, the answer was, well, the process figured it out. The process decided who got promoted. The process decided. And I said to you before, right? At that point, I stopped wanting to be a partner. I wanted to become the process one day, because apparently the process, right, was now running the firm. And so we're now at that, on the brink of that next step, right, where it's not a stupid algorithm, which is what that was, but it's a smart one, and it's going to decide, you know what, you've been here for 2 years, you haven't done anything wrong, but based on all these variables, you're never going to make partner. So you just need to go ahead and go.
I hope though that the other side is not true, which is, I feel like so much innovation has been slowed down. Yeah. I want to avoid a situation where we cancel AI, right? I think every this cancel culture we have. If the government goes too far extreme and starts banning apps because they don't understand them, and because they don't see the upside, they only see the downside, and it gets politicized, then we also don't advance as a society. So while I'm concerned about these unintended consequences and the acceleration that we're at, I'm also concerned about especially government bureaucrats getting involved and just killing something that really I think is key to, because in a lot of ways we've been behind in technology. And certainly I think in the US in a lot of areas, but one of the things that does make this different, and you touched upon this, is the trackability. One of the reasons why RPA and automation ended up catching on so well is that it allowed companies to keep their legacy applications intact, number one. And number two, when they were replacing people or changing people's jobs, the regulators actually liked automation because there was an even better track record in automation, software automation, than there was with people, right? The actions of a person weren't always tracked, but the actions of a robot were always tracked. And so regulators like the track record to say, okay, you may not have intended to be racist in that hiring, but here's what happened, and here's where it went wrong, and let's fix this and make sure it doesn't happen. You don't have that with AI. You don't have that trackability. So it's even more accelerated with less trackability.
The thing that I like to see is not just the pause for, okay, what are we building, but also, why are we building it? So let's go back quickly, right, the last decade or so. You think about the biggest tech creations and how they affected your world. Let's start with Uber. So now you can get a taxi a lot faster than you could before. Was it really that bad? I mean,
Yes, it was
okay,
terrible.
but think about all the tens of thousands of engineering lives and hours that were spent to solve that problem. What is that there's no, like, have we worked through all the other stuff that we got to, like, number 72? I can't get a taxi on a rainy day. So, oh, and by the way, I can't get food delivered to my house. That was the next one on the list. It's just like we skipped like the first 50 problems, and we started at 51, which is I can't get a cab on a rainy day. I can't get a decent hotel room, right? So for some reason I want meat that's fake, whatever. So it would be nice that we would also take a step back and say, if we're going to rush all this money, because it looks like they had to, in that article, the comment about 4 Google AI people who quit, and a month later had a startup that was worth $100 million, right? According to the valuation papers, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, if you're going to go from 0 to 100 millionaire because you do an AI startup, can you do it? And that's why I get another, to the next Uber or the next Airbnb, right? Or whatever, Chew Toys website. Is it possible that we sort of refocus this on some bigger issues, disinformation, climate change, right? Some of the things that are the real problems that seem like this whole last generation of wealth creation in the Valley skipped that list.
I agree with you. I think there's a couple of different things happening though there. One is as far as those the taxi problem and things like that, I have 2 answers. One answer is that it's just evolution, and it's what's happened, and we're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle. The next generation is used to things being that way, and it's not going to go backwards. So we've got to figure out a way to rein it in and manage it, and that kind of thing. And part of it is because what was available 3-4 years ago were spot AI solutions or narrow AI solutions that they couldn't solve big problems yet. They could only solve very, very, narrow issues. And so I think those are the starting points and the stepping stones for what is yet to come that does have bigger capabilities. But I'll tell you what I think is good about it. I think it has the potential, and I say potential, underlined because of all the issues we've talked about, the bias and things like that. But if we do this in a smart way and have a roadmap, then it has the potential to fix some of the things that we've done wrong in the past. Things like bias, right? Things like, we somehow got away from, and this is the other thing that excites me about this is you have the ability now to, give access to the whole democratization of AI, give access to the average person. So, anybody with an internet connection can get the benefits of this. That wasn't true with technology 5 years ago. That wasn't true. And it wasn't true from a customer experience standpoint. At some point, we got away from this thing that everybody was taught in the 50s and 60s that the customer is always right. I don't know about you, but I haven't felt that way in a long time, right? These companies, stopped caring about the customer and started caring more about their own rules and policies and profitability. That's going to change. The Uber example to me is an example of the customer gets what they want when they want it, at all costs. And I think that's ultimately this flaws, but it's ultimately a good thing.
I don't have anything against Uber.
Yes, you do. You hate Uber. You hate them all.
My only issue is that with all the money that went into the creation of the Uber platform, right, and that whole ecosystem, were there no other bigger societal issues that a phenomenal investment technology would have been better spent on?
Would they have made the same money though? That's the issue with the pure capitalist perspective.
Now back to the heart.
It's about monetization. It's not about human good. It's about monetization, right?
Now we're back to the heart of the matter, right? Which is that if we're gonna just let everybody here run to the hills, I guess I'm less worried about a nuclear effect. I'm more worried about we're just gonna wind up with like some stupid AI version of TikTok, right? And 10 years from now, and however many billions of dollars and millions of engineering lives wasted, right? And it really won't have done that much for us. Yeah, there'll be something which is kind of cool like Uber, but all the world's real issues are going to be kind of even worse. So it would be nice if all the people who are very smart and very talented who are building these new technologies can just pause, not just for how they're making them, but what are you going to
I love it.
I love it. Work them on, right?
But this is the problem. The problem is politicians still run the government, right? If the government came out and said, "Hey, you don't like socialism, you don't like Social Security, you don't like taxes," and if they actually said, "Okay, Google," or "Okay, we're gonna put a fund aside of $5 billion to the company who can solve this bureaucratic problem with AI and follow these guidelines." So there you go. It's not government run. It'll be private run, but it's paid for by the government sanctioned, government regulated. Then you have something, right? Instead of all these debates all the time, oh, it's going to take jobs, and people running for election and trying to win a job. It's just so clouded, right? But if you actually go out to these companies and give them the right incentives, to create something like that for good instead of talking about how many manufacturing jobs we bring back. I mean, there's something to that.
Look, take AI and solve disinformation, solve deepfakes, right? Sustain democracy, protect elections, right? Fix voting, all these issues. I think you do that, and hopefully the wealth comes along with that, and all the rewards will come along with it. Like I said, I would hate to see for us to be sitting here 10 years from now, and what we've got is a new way to order lunch.
It's all. I said this on a previous podcast I was on this morning. It's all about incentives. You have to create the right incentives. And right now in the U.S., other than some people that want to do some good things, and by the way, your favorite person, Elon Musk, he's done a lot actually, right? In healthcare and other spaces, he's actually done projects where he doesn't know if they'll ever make any money doing it, but he believes in the projects and he's doing it anyway. But that's not typical, right? The typical company in the U.S. that has shareholders that only care about profitability aren't going to create that unless there's profitability. They're just not.
Let's hope that somehow the stars align, right, and that there is the right set of incentives for the great teams that are building these AI machines to focus on the serious issues that.
Let's hire them, right? Let's if you're the government, if you're in the government or you're in the public sector right now, hire these companies to solve some of your public problems, right? Instead of at one point they were trying to reinvest money in the post office to compete with Amazon. Why? Why? Outsource the post office to Amazon. Stop fighting it.
We've kept companies like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, right? Halliburton, the government, right, has kept these companies thriving ever since World War II because we felt it was a matter of national security.
Yep.
And so we might see 20 years from now, right? Call it the AI industrial complex, right? Good or bad, where what you just said is what happens. And you say, look, from now on, there's going to be a Halliburton, a Lockheed Martin of AI. There's going to be a General Dynamics of AI. There's going to be Northrop Grumman of AI. And these are companies that build new platforms, right? Which is what they call them in the defense world, to solve big societal issues and keep us safe, right? And move society forward.
Yep.
Let's
the opportunity. See, we ended on a positive note, Carlos.
Hopefully, at least that's part of the solution.
Right? I love it. I love it.
As always, we're out of time. It looks like too soon.
Good show as always, we'll keep this conversation going. I'm sure there's a lot here. So agree or disagree. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you want to talk about. Us to talk about on future shows. This is something we do for the industry and for my members and Carlos's followers. So we're here to help. If there's anything you need help with, let us know. Reach out to us. Check us out at DEInetwork.com. And in the meantime, we will be back next Wednesday. Same bat time, same bat channel. Yes, Carlos?
Absolutely, Dan. We'll see you next week.
Have a great week, everybody. Take care.